Danny Cole never thought of himself as special in any way, and he was just a regular guy from a small town in Ohio who had somehow ended up in space as a communications officer aboard the Earth vessel called the Starward Dream. He had joined the space program because he wanted to see the stars and maybe find some adventure along the way, but he never expected that adventure would find him in the most embarrassing way possible. The Starward Dream had been selected for humanity's first official diplomatic mission to the Volanti Empire, and the Volanti were one of the oldest and most powerful civilizations in the known galaxy, with territories spanning across 15 star systems and a history that went back over 50,000 years. Humanity had only discovered faster than light travel about 30 years ago, and compared to the Volanti, they were like children taking their first steps into a very large and very dangerous playground. Ambassador Patricia Lane had spent 6 months preparing the crew for this mission, and she had drilled every rule and protocol into their heads until Danny could recite them in his sleep. Do not speak unless spoken to, and do not make direct eye contact with royalty for more than 3 seconds, and do not show your teeth under any circumstances, and do not touch anyone without permission, and above all, do not do anything that could be interpreted as romantic or intimate, because the Volanti had very different ideas about such things. Danny had listened to all of this and had nodded along and had promised to be on his best behavior, because his job was simple anyway, and all he had to do was stand in the back of the room and monitor the translation equipment to make sure everyone could understand each other. The throne room of the Volanti Imperial Palace was the most beautiful and terrifying place Danny had ever seen, and it was carved entirely from living crystal that pulsed with soft light and colors he did not have names for. Ceiling stretched up so high that it disappeared into a gentle glow, and the walls were lined with hundreds of Volanti nobles who stood in perfect silence watching the human delegation enter. The Volanti themselves were tall and elegant, with skin in various shades of purple and violet and eyes that glowed like molten gold, and they moved with a grace that made Danny feel clumsy just standing still. Emperor Voltorix sat upon a throne that seemed to grow directly from the crystal floor, and beside him sat the Empress, and around them stood various members of the royal family. Danny kept his eyes down and focused on his tablet, and tried to remember all the rules he had been taught. But then a door at the side of the chamber opened, and someone new entered. Princess Calvera Thaxini was the third daughter of the Emperor, and she was beautiful in a way that made Danny forget how to breathe for a moment. Her skin was the color of pale amethyst, and her eyes were like pools of liquid gold, and she wore robes that flowed around her like water made of starlight, and she moved through the crowd with a confidence that drew every eye in the room, including Danny's eyes. He did not mean to stare, and he definitely did not mean to make eye contact, but somehow their gazes met across the crowded throne room, and for just a moment the rest of the world seemed to fade away. Danny was exhausted from the long journey and nervous beyond measure, and running on only 4 hours of sleep. And in that moment, his brain simply forgot every rule he had ever been taught. He smiled at her. It was not a diplomatic smile or a careful practiced expression, but just a genuine warm human smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and showed his teeth and radiated a simple friendly warmth. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Princess Calvera stopped walking so suddenly that her attendants crashed into each other behind her, and a gasp rippled through the assembled nobles that quickly grew into shocked murmurs and whispers. Danny saw Ambassador Lane's face go pale, and he felt his stomach drop as he realized he had done something very, very wrong. "What did you do?" The ambassador hissed at him through clenched teeth. "I just smiled at her," Danny whispered back, feeling confused and terrified in equal measure. Before anyone could explain what was happening, the princess had crossed the entire throne room floor in long, purposeful strides, and she stopped directly in front of Danny, looking down at him with an expression he could not read. She was nearly 7 feet tall, and Danny had to crane his neck back to meet her golden eyes, which were now fixed on him with an intensity that made him want to run away and hide. She spoke a single word in the Volanthi language, and then she turned to face the assembled crowd and declared something in a voice that rang through the crystal chamber like a bell. Danny's translation earpiece crackled, and then delivered the words that would change his life forever. This one, and I claim this one as my chosen consort. The throne room erupted into absolute chaos. Volanthi nobles began shouting over each other, and the human delegation stood frozen in shock, and Ambassador Lane looked like she might actually faint, and Danny just stood there trying to understand what had just happened. 2 guards in crystal armor appeared on either side of Danny, and they did not touch him, but their presence made it very clear that he was not going anywhere. Your Highness. Ambassador Lane stepped forward with her hands raised in a placating gesture. There has been some kind of misunderstanding, and Lieutenant Cole did not mean to cause any offense. The princess turned to look at the ambassador, and her expression was calm but firm. There is no misunderstanding, she said, in accented but clear English. Your officer has made his intentions known in the manner of my people, and I have accepted those intentions, and according to the laws of the Volanthi Empire, we are now bound in formal courtship. But he just smiled. Ambassador Lane protested. Yes, the princess agreed, and for the first time something like warmth flickered in her golden eyes. He smiled at me with his whole heart, and in my culture, that is the most intimate declaration one can make, and I will not dishonor such a gift by refusing it. Danny finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a squeak. I am very sorry, Your Highness, but I did not know what smiling means to your people, and I was not trying to propose or anything like that. The princess looked at him and tilted her head slightly to one side. And yet you did smile, she said. You saw me, and your heart moved you to show me warmth and welcome, and whether you intended it or not, that is what happened, and I choose to honor it. She reached out and took his hand in hers, and her skin was cool and smooth like polished stone, and Danny felt a strange tingle where their skin touched. Come, she said. We have much to discuss and 6 months of courtship to begin, and I promise you that by the end you will not regret your smile. As Danny was led away by the alien princess who had just claimed him as her future husband, he looked back at his crewmates and saw a mixture of horror and sympathy on their faces. Carmen Diaz, the ship's pilot, gave him a small wave and mouthed the words, "Good luck." And Danny had a feeling he was going to need all the luck he could get. He had come to space looking for adventure, and now he had found more adventure than he had ever bargained for, and all because he had forgotten one simple rule: never smile at an alien princess. Danny sat in a room made entirely of blue crystal and watched the walls pulse with soft light and patterns. He did not understand, and he wondered how his life had gone so wrong so quickly. The room was beautiful in an alien way, with furniture that seemed to grow from the floor and windows that looked out over a city of glittering spires. But Danny could not appreciate any of it because he was too busy panicking. Ambassador Lane had been pacing back and forth for the past hour, and she had worn a visible path in the crystal floor, and her face had not regained its normal color since the throne room incident. Do you have any idea what you have done? She demanded for what felt like the 100th time. I smiled, Danny repeated, because that was all he could say. I just smiled at her, and I did not know it meant anything, and I'm sorry. Dr. Helen Price had been called in to explain exactly how badly Danny had messed up, and she was the mission's expert on alien cultures, and she sat across from Danny with a tablet full of notes and an expression that mixed horror with scientific fascination. The Volanthi do not smile, Helen explained in a tone that suggested she was trying very hard to remain calm. Their facial muscles are not designed for it, and they do not have the biological ability to create the expression that humans make so easily. Okay, Danny said slowly. So what does that mean? It means that to them a smile is incredibly rare and meaningful, and when You smiled at the princess. You were not just being friendly. Helen pulled up some data on her tablet. In Volanti culture direct, eye contact combined with a display of teeth and the crinkling of skin around the eyes is considered the most intimate gesture possible, and it is essentially a declaration of deep emotional connection and absolute trust. Danny felt sick to his stomach. So when I smiled at her, he said, "You basically proposed marriage in the most romantically aggressive way there culture has ever seen," Helen finished. "And you did it in front of the entire imperial court." Ambassador Lane stopped pacing and turned to face Danny with her arms crossed. "The Volanti take matters of honor very seriously," she said. "When the princess publicly declared you as her chosen consort, it became a matter of imperial prestige. And if you refuse her, it will be seen as an insult to the entire royal family." "What happens if I insult the royal family?" Danny asked, even though he was not sure. He wanted to know the answer. "War," Ambassador Lane said flatly. "The Volanti have destroyed entire civilizations over smaller offenses, and humanity is in no position to fight them." Danny put his head in his hands and tried to breathe through the panic that was threatening to overwhelm him. "So I have to marry an alien princess because I smiled at her," he said. "You have to participate in the courtship at minimum," Helen said in a gentler tone. "The courtship period lasts 6 months, and during that time many things can happen, and maybe she will change her mind, or maybe we can find a diplomatic solution." A chime sounded and a tall Volanti attendant entered the room, and he had silver skin and golden eyes, and he moved with the fluid grace that all Volanti seemed to possess. "The princess requests Lieutenant Cole's presence for the evening meal," he announced in careful English. "She wishes to begin the traditional courtship rituals." Danny opened his mouth to refuse, but Ambassador Lane caught his eye and shook her head slightly, and he understood that refusing was not an option. "I will be there," he said, and his voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. The attendant bowed and departed, and Danny was left alone with his fear and his confusion and his overwhelming sense that the universe was playing some kind of cruel joke on him. That evening, 2 guards escorted Danny through the crystal corridors of the palace to a private dining chamber, and the room was smaller than he expected and more intimate, with a table set for 2 and soft light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Princess Kelvira was already waiting, and she had changed from her formal robes into something simpler, though still elegant, and without the crowd of nobles around her, she seemed almost nervous. "Please sit," she said, and gestured to the chair across from her. "I have had the cooks prepare dishes that should be safe for human digestion." Danny sat down and looked at the food spread before him, and none of it looked familiar, but it all smelled surprisingly good. "Your Highness," he began. "Kelvira," she interrupted. "If we are to be courting, you should use my name, Kelvira." Danny tried again, and the name felt strange on his tongue. "I need you to understand that in my culture, smiling does not mean what it means in yours. And when I smiled at you, I was not trying to propose or declare my love or anything like that." "I know," she said, and her golden eyes met his. "Your ambassador has explained this to me in great detail, and she was very thorough and very worried." "Then why are you doing this?" Danny asked. "Why are you going through with a courtship that started with a misunderstanding?" The princess was quiet for a moment, and she looked down at her hands, which were folded in her lap. "Because it does not matter what you meant to do," she said finally. "What matters is what I felt in that moment." And when our eyes met across the throne room, something happened inside me, and I felt a connection that I have never felt before. She looked up at him, and there was vulnerability in her golden eyes that surprised him. "I am the 3rd daughter of the Emperor," she continued. "I have no real power and no real purpose. And my entire life, I have been told that my only value is in the alliance my marriage might secure. And I have met many suitors over the years, and all of them looked at me and saw only a political advantage." She paused and took a breath. "But you looked at me, and you smiled." And in that smile I saw warmth and kindness and genuine human feeling, and maybe you did not mean it as a proposal, but you meant it as something, and that something was more real than anything any suitor has ever offered. Me, Danny did not know what to say, and he sat in silence, trying to process her words. I am not a fool, Kelvira said. I know that you do not love me, and I know that you did not choose this, and I know that you are scared and confused and probably wishing you had never left your home planet. She reached across the table and took his hand, and her cool fingers wrapped around his. But I am asking you to give me a chance, she said. 6 months is all I ask, and if at the end of that time you truly do not want to be with me, I will release you from the courtship with honor, and no harm will come to you or your people, and you have my word. Danny looked at her, and he saw that she was being sincere, and that beneath her royal composure she was just as scared as he was. 6 months, he said slowly. And if I still want to leave after that, you will let me go. Yes, she promised. You will be free to return to your ship and your people, and I will make sure that there are no consequences. Danny thought about his options and realized that he did not really have any, and 6 months was not forever, and maybe things would work out somehow. Okay, he said. 6 months. The princess smiled at him, and it was an awkward expression that looked like she had practiced it in front of a mirror, and it was clumsy and strange, and somehow it made Danny's heart do something unexpected. Thank you, she said. I will make sure you do not regret this, and I hope. And despite everything, Danny found himself hoping too. 3 months had passed since Danny Cole accidentally proposed to an alien princess, and in that time, everything had changed. Woke up each morning in his guest quarters, which were larger than his entire apartment back on Earth, and he spent his days learning about Volanti culture and language and history, and he spent his evenings with Kelvira talking and laughing and discovering that she was nothing like he had expected. The courtship rituals of the Volanti were strange, but Danny had grown to appreciate them, and each ritual was designed to help the two people involved truly understand each other. In the first month, they had exchanged memory crystals, which were small gems that could hold recordings of important moments from a person's life, and Danny had shared memories of his childhood in Ohio, and his grandmother teaching him to cook, and his first day at the Space Academy, and the moment he saw Earth from orbit for the first time. Kelvira had shared memories of growing up in the palace and learning to walk through the crystal gardens with her mother and studying quantum physics because it was the only thing that made her feel like more than just a political tool, and the loneliness she felt at every formal dinner, surrounded by people who saw her as nothing but a bargaining chip watching her memories had made Danny see her differently, and she was not just a princess who had claimed him because of a misunderstanding, but she was a person who had spent her whole life feeling invisible and unimportant, and his smile had made her feel seen for the first time. In the second month, they had learned each other's languages, and Danny discovered that Volanti was surprisingly beautiful once you got past the difficult pronunciation, and Kelvira had thrown herself into learning English with a dedication that impressed him. She practiced human expressions in front of the mirror, and she watched Earth movies to understand human humor, and she asked Danny endless questions about human customs and traditions, and she listened to his answers with genuine interest. Danny had started teaching her about human food, and he had convinced the palace cooks to let him make his grandmother's pot roast one evening. And Kelvira had tried it with a puzzled expression and declared that it was interestingly textured, which Danny chose to interpret as a compliment. In return, she had introduced him to Volanti cuisine, which was mostly based on plants that grew in the crystal forests, and some of it was delicious, and some of it made his eyes water, but he ate everything she offered because he could see how much it meant to her. Now in the third month, Danny found himself walking through the crystal gardens with Kelvira, and the 3 moons of Volanti Prime were rising over the distant mountains, and the light made everything glow in shades of silver and blue. "You are quiet tonight," Kelvira observed, and her golden eyes had shifted to a softer shade. That Danny had learned meant she was concerned. I'm thinking," Danny admitted. "About what?" "About how different everything is from what I expected." Danny stopped walking and turned to face her. "When this started, I was terrified, and I thought I was trapped in some kind of nightmare, and I spent every day counting down until the 6 months would be over." Kelvira's eyes flickered to a pale yellow that indicated sadness. "And now?" she asked quietly. "Now I do not count the days anymore," Danny said. "Now I wake up looking forward to seeing you, and I go to sleep thinking about our conversations, and somewhere along the way you stopped being the alien princess who claimed me, and you became just Kelvira." Her eyes shifted to a brighter gold, and she tilted her head in that curious way she had. "What does that mean?" she asked. Danny took a deep breath, because he was about to say something that scared him more than the day he first arrived on this planet. "It means that my feelings have changed," he said. "It means that when I look at you now, I do not see an obligation or a diplomatic necessity, and I see someone brilliant and funny and kind, and I see someone who makes me happy." Kelvira was very still, and her eyes had gone to a color Danny had never seen before, and it was a deep amber that seemed to glow from within. "Danny," she whispered, and it was the first time she had used his first name without his title. "I know this started as an accident," Danny continued. "I know I did not mean to smile at you that day in the throne room, but I'm glad I did, and I'm glad you chose me, even if you chose me for the wrong reasons." He reached out and took her hand, and her cool fingers intertwined with his. "I think I'm falling in love with you," he said. "And that terrifies me, but it also makes me happier than I have ever been." Kelvira made a sound that Danny had never heard from a Volante before, and it took him a moment to realize she was crying, and the tears that ran down her purple cheeks were silver like liquid moonlight. "I have waited my whole life," she said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "I have waited to hear someone say those words to me and mean them, and I had given up hope that it would ever happen." She reached up with her free hand and touched his face, and her fingers traced the lines around his eyes. "When you smiled at me," she said, "it was like the sun coming out after a lifetime of darkness, and I knew in that moment that I wanted to know the person behind that smile, and I wanted to understand what made you capable of such warmth." Danny leaned into her touch, and he felt the cool smoothness of her palm against his cheek. "And now that you know me," he asked, "now that I know you, I love you more than I thought possible," she said. "You are kind and brave and funny, and you make me feel like I matter, and not because I am a princess, but because I am me." Danny smiled at her, and this time the smile was intentional, and it carried all the feeling he had been afraid to express. "That color in your eyes," he said. "The amber color, and what does it mean?" "It means joy," she whispered. "It means that my heart is so full it cannot contain the feeling." She leaned down and pressed her forehead against his, and Danny had learned that this was the Volante equivalent of a kiss, and it was a gesture of deep intimacy and trust. They stood that way for a long time, with their foreheads touching and their hands intertwined, and the 3 moons painted silver light across the crystal gardens. "I love you," Danny said again because it felt good to say it. "I love you too," Kelvira replied, and her voice was steady now and certain. "My chosen consort and my accidental suitor and my Danny." They walked back to the palace hand in hand, and for the first time since he arrived on Volante Prime, Danny felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Had come to space looking for adventure, and instead, he had found something far more precious, and he had found someone who saw him not as a communications officer or a diplomatic problem, but as a person worth loving, his friend Carmen. Diaz had been right all along, and Danny was falling for the alien princess, but now he did not mind falling at all because he knew that Kelvira would be there to catch him. The happiness lasted exactly 17 more days. Danny was in his quarters, reviewing Volanti language lessons when the alarm began to sound, and it was a deep resonant tone that vibrated through the crystal walls and made his teeth ache. He rushed to the window and saw a massive warship descending through the clouds, and it was unlike any Volanti vessel he had seen before, and it was dark and angular, where the Imperial ships were bright and flowing. Within an hour, Danny was summoned to the throne room, and he found Kelvira waiting for him at the entrance, and her eyes were a pale yellow that he now knew meant fear. "What is happening?" he asked as he took her hand. "Lord Dex Allen has come," she said, and her voice was tight. "His family controls the outer territories, and they are very powerful and very dangerous. What does he want?" Kelvira did not answer, but her grip on his hand tightened. The throne room was full of tension when they entered, and Emperor Valtarix sat upon his throne with an expression that Danny could not read, and beside him stood a Volanti unlike any Danny had seen before. Lord Dex Allen was massive, and he stood nearly 8 feet tall with shoulders as wide as a doorway, and his skin was a dark purple that was almost black, and his golden eyes burned with cold fury. Behind him stood a younger Volanti who looked like a smaller version of the Lord, and who watched Danny with a cruel smile that made his blood run cold. "You have received my message," Lord Dex Allen said to the Emperor, and his voice was like thunder rolling across mountains. "I have," the Emperor replied calmly, "and I have considered your concerns." "Concerns?" Lord Dex Allen's voice rose. "This is not a concern, but an insult of the highest order, and the Princess Kelvira was promised to my son Kexover before these humans even knew how to make fire, and now she throws away centuries of alliance for this creature." He pointed at Danny, and every eye in the room turned to look at him. "The princess invoked the right of first sight," the Emperor said. "This supersedes all prior arrangements, and you know this as well as I do. First sight requires that the chosen be worthy," Lord Dex Allen countered, "and I do not believe this human is worthy of anything, except perhaps cleaning the floors of my ship." Laughter rippled through the nobles who had come with Lord Dex Allen, and Danny felt his face flush with anger and humiliation. "I invoke my right to challenge," Lord Dex Allen continued. "Let this human prove himself in combat against my son, and if he cannot, then let him be exposed as the weak, pathetic creature he obviously is." The room went very quiet, and Danny felt Kelvira's hand tighten around his until it almost hurt. "The challenge is valid according to our laws," the Emperor said slowly. "Lieutenant Cole, do you accept?" Danny looked at Kelvira and saw the fear in her eyes, and he looked at Kexover, who was even larger than his father, and who was already smiling in anticipation of an easy victory. "What happens if I refuse?" Danny asked. "Then you admit that you are unworthy," Lord Dex Allen said with satisfaction, "and the courtship is dissolved, and the princess will marry my son as was always intended. And if I accept, then you fight my son to the death." Lord Dex Allen's smile was vicious. "Either way, I win human." Danny's mind raced as he considered his options, and he was a communications officer, not a warrior, and he had never been in a real fight in his life, and Kexover looked like he could tear Danny apart without breaking a sweat. But if he refused, then Kelvira would be forced to marry someone she did not love, and everything they had built together would be destroyed. And she would spend the rest of her life trapped in a loveless marriage. "I accept," Danny heard himself say. The room erupted in murmurs, and Kelvira grabbed his arm and pulled him close. "You cannot do this," she whispered urgently. "He will kill you." "Maybe," Danny admitted, "but I am not going to run away and leave you to face this alone, and you chose me, and now I choose you." The combat was scheduled for 3 days later, and Danny spent every waking moment training with the Imperial Weapons Master. And he learned to use a crystal blade that hummed with energy, and he learned the basic forms of Volanti combat. But 3 days was not enough time to become a warrior, and everyone knew it. On the night before the fight, Kelvira came to his quarters. and she had been crying, and her silver tears had left tracks on her purple cheeks. "Please do not do this," she begged. "I will find another way, and I will talk to my father, and we can figure something out." "There is no other way," Danny said gently. "You know that as well as I do, and if I back down now, you lose everything. I would rather lose everything than lose you," she said, and her voice broke on the last word. Danny pulled her into his arms and held her close, and he could feel her body shaking with silent sobs. "I love you," he said, "and I am going to fight for you, because that is what you do when you love someone, and maybe I will lose, but at least I will lose trying." Calvera pulled back and looked at him, and her golden eyes were filled with a mixture of love and fear and pride. "Then fight well, my consort," she said. "Fight well and come back to me." The arena was a massive circular space carved into the heart of a mountain, and thousands of Volanthi filled the seats that rose up on all sides, and Danny felt very small standing in the center of that vast space. Kexover entered from the opposite side, and he moved with the confidence of someone who had never lost a fight in his life, and his crystal blade gleamed in his hand. "Little human," Kexover called out, "I am going to enjoy breaking you, and when you are dead, I am going to take the princess as my bride, and I'm going to make sure she forgets you ever existed." Danny raised his own blade and felt its hum travel up his arm. "Come and try," he said. The fight was brutal from the very first moment, and Kexover was faster than Danny had expected and stronger than seemed possible, and within the first minute, Danny was bleeding from cuts on his arm and shoulder, dodged and weaved and blocked when he could, and he used his smaller size to avoid the worst of Kexover's attacks, but he was taking damage with every exchange. Crowd watched in silence as the human was systematically beaten and blood dripped from Danny's wounds onto the crystal floor, and his arms burned with exhaustion. But he did not fall. Every time Kexover knocked him down, Danny got back up, and every time the Volanthi expected him to yield, Danny raised his blade and kept fighting. "Stay down," Kexover growled. "You have proven nothing, except that humans are too stupid to know when they are beaten. I am not fighting to prove anything," Danny said through gritted teeth. "I am fighting for the woman I love, and I will keep fighting until my heart stops." He launched himself at Kexover with a wild attack that had no form or technique, but was driven by pure, desperate determination, and the Volanthi blocked easily. But Danny kept coming. The crowd began to murmur, and the murmurs grew louder, and Danny realized that they were not murmurs of contempt, but of something else entirely. They were impressed. This tiny, fragile human, who had no chance of winning, refused to give up, and refused to break, and refused to stop fighting. No matter how badly he was hurt, Kexar grew frustrated, and his attacks became more aggressive and less controlled, and Danny saw his chance when Kexover overextended on a strike meant to end the fight. Danny ducked under the blade and spun and drove his weapon into the gap in Kexover's armor at the shoulders of Volanthi. Warrior fell to his knees with a cry of pain, and his sword arm hung useless at his side. Danny stood over him with his blade raised, and the arena went completely silent. He could kill Kexover now, and no one would stop him, and no one would blame him, and it would be a righteous victory. But Danny thought about who he was and who he wanted to be, and he knew that killing was not the answer. "Yield," Danny said. Kexover looked up at him with shock and disbelief. "You would spare me." "I am not here to kill you," Danny said. "I am here to prove that I am worthy of the woman I love, and I have done that, and there is no need for more blood." He lowered his blade and stepped back. "Yield, and this ends." For a long moment, Kexover was silent, and then slowly he bowed his head. "I yield," he said. The arena exploded with noise, and Danny looked up to see thousands of Volanthi cheering and stamping their feet, and he saw Calvera pushing through the crowd toward him with tears streaming down her face. She reached him and threw her arms around him and held him tight. "You did it," she whispered. "You wonderful, impossible human, and you did it." Danny held her back and felt the pain of his wounds fade away because nothing hurt when she was in his arms. "I told you," he said. "I fight for the people I love." The wedding of Princess Calvira Thaxini and Danny Cole was the largest celebration in the history of the Volanthi Empire. Representatives came from all 15 star systems, and ambassadors arrived from dozens of other civilizations who wanted to witness the union that had captured the imagination of the entire galaxy, and the story of the human who smiled at a princess had spread across the stars like wildfire. The ceremony was held in the Great Crystal Cathedral at the heart of the Imperial City, and the building could hold over 50,000 guests, and every seat was filled. Danny stood at the altar and tried not to pass out from nervousness, and beside him stood his best man Carmen Diaz, who had threatened to punch him if he fainted. "Breathe," Carmen whispered. "You survived a death match, and you can survive saying, 'I do.'" "The death match was easier," Danny whispered back. "At least in the death match, I could move around." The music began, and everyone turned to look as the great doors at the far end of the cathedral opened. Calvira entered, and Danny forgot how to breathe. She wore a gown that combined human and Volanthi traditions, and it was white like a earth wedding dress, but it flowed and shimmered like starlight, in the way that Volanthi formal wear always did, and she carried flowers from both planets in her bouquet. Her amethyst skin glowed against the white fabric, and her golden eyes found his across the vast space, and she smiled. It was still an awkward expression on her Volanthi face, but she had practiced so much that it almost looked natural, and Danny felt tears prick at his eyes because she had learned to smile. Just for him, she walked down the aisle with her father, the Emperor, at her side. And every step brought her closer, and every step made Danny's heart beat faster. When she reached him, she took his hands in hers, and her cool fingers intertwined with his warm ones. "You look beautiful," he whispered. "You look terrified," she whispered back, and there was laughter in her golden eyes. "I am terrified," he admitted, "but I am also the happiest I have ever been." The ceremony combined traditions from both their cultures, and they exchanged vows in English and in Volanthi, and they traded rings and memory crystals, and they sealed their union with both a human kiss and a Volanthi forehead touch. When the officiant declared them married, the cathedral erupted in cheers that shook the crystal walls. The reception was held in the palace gardens, and Danny found himself surrounded by well-wishers from 100 different worlds, and he shook hands and accepted congratulations and tried to remember names that his human tongue could barely pronounce. His family had come from Earth for the wedding, and his mother had cried through the entire ceremony, and his father had shaken Calvira's hand and welcomed her to the family, and his grandmother had declared that she was a lovely girl even if she is purple. Ambassador Lane gave a toast that surprised everyone. When Lieutenant Cole first smiled at the princess, she said, "I was certain he had doomed humanity, and I spent weeks trying to figure out how to fix his mistake, and I never imagined that his mistake would turn out to be the best thing that ever happened to our two peoples." She raised her glass to Danny and Calvira, and may their love be a bridge between our civilizations. The crowd cheered and drank, and Danny felt Calvira squeeze his hand later that night. When the celebration had finally wound down, Danny and Calvira found their way to the same observatory balcony where they had first admitted their feelings for each other. The 3 moons hung in the sky, and the crystal city sparkled below them. And somewhere in the distance, music still played. "Regrets?" Danny asked. "None," Calvira said. "You? Only that I did not smile at you sooner." She laughed, and it was a beautiful sound that Danny would never get tired of hearing. "If you had smiled at that Stowe smiled at me sooner, you would not have been you," she said. "And I fell in love with exactly who you are, and not some other version of you." Danny thought about that and realized she was right, and every moment of his life had led to that throne room and that smile and this woman standing beside him. "When we first met," he said, "you told me that you felt a connection, and that the universe was telling you to pay attention to me, And did you really feel that? Yes, she said without hesitation. I know it. Sounds strange, but in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that you were important and that you would change my life. And have I? Danny asked. Changed your life, I mean. Calvara turned to face him, and her golden eyes were that deep amber color that meant joy. You have changed everything, she said. Before you I was invisible, and now I am seen, and before you I was lonely, and now I am loved, and before you I was just a princess waiting to be traded away, and now I am a wife and a partner. And a person who matters. She reached up and touched his face the way she had in the garden 3 months ago. You changed my life with a smile. Danny Cole and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for that. Danny pulled her close and held her tight and breathed in the strange sweet scent of her hair. I love you, he said. My princess and my wife and my Calvera. I love you too, she replied. My consort and my human and my Danny. They stood together on the balcony and watched the moons trace their paths across the alien sky, and Danny thought about how far he had come from that small town in Ohio. He had wanted to see the stars and find adventure, and instead he had found something far more precious, and he had found a love that spanned the distance between worlds and a partner who saw him for exactly who he was in the years that followed. Danny would become an ambassador and a bridge between two civilizations, and he and Calvera would work together to strengthen the bonds between humanity and the Volante Empire. They would have children who had their mother's golden eyes and their father's warm smile, and those children would grow up knowing that they were the product of a love that had started with a simple accident. Historians would write about the smile that changed history, and poets would compose verses about the human who won a princess with nothing but kindness, and diplomats would study the marriage as an example of how different peoples could find common ground. But Danny never thought of himself as special or as a figure of historical importance. He was just a guy from Ohio who had smiled at a beautiful woman and been lucky enough that she had smiled back, and every night for the rest of their lives, when the moons rose over the crystal spires of Volante Prime, Danny would look at his wife and smile, and she would smile back, because that was their story, and it had started with a smile, and it would end with a smile, and everything in between was just two people learning to love each other across the vast distances of space. The end.